Hey, if you had 8-track tapes, records, cassettes back in the 80s, or you remember having your stereo way back then, I've got this short little article that I found from an old newspaper. I think you're going to really enjoy listening to this. Because if you remember back in the early 80s, so many things were changing. Records, though, had been around for so long, and they were very common. They'd been around, people have been putting music out on those things for a long, long time. But the 8-track tape and the cassette were kind of this, they were this other thing. And it was interesting watching those trends change because the 8-track for a while became so popular. And then unceremoniously, just boom, it was gone. And it was, in my opinion, it was a terrible format. I have a whole video on this channel where I talk about why an 8-track tape is an 8-track tape. And it was a fascinating format, but it was a terrible design. And they just wore out really fast. You had to have that thing when you'd put the tape in and it would switch to a different track. And all of a sudden in the middle of a song, the song would stop and you'd hear the clunk, clunk, then it would shift and then the song would pick back up. I remember I had a 8-track of Dark Side of the Moon, and I think it was right in the middle of Money, as I recall. It would just, this song would stop and then it'd start back over. It was just awful. We had one in our car and I used to play it in there and it was terrible. But this is really fun. It's very short. But they kind of deal with that issue in this article. And if you live during that time, I think you'll enjoy just hearing this and reminiscing a little bit about what it was like back then. And the title of this article, this is from the Grand Rapids Press, Saturday, January 23rd, 1982. And it's called Trends Change Stereo Gear 2. And it's by Bill Marsh from Grand Rapids Junior College. Interesting. In the early 70s, calculators sold for hundreds of dollars. These same models, considered primitive today, now they start around $6. Boy, do you, by the way, if you lived, because I lived during this time, do you remember that? Where I remember my dad bought a calculator, his first one, had these big orange numbers on it, or red as I recall, and in the buttons you'd have to push them. And I remember he spent a lot of money on that. And then by the time I was in high school, they were solar powered and they cost $1 or $2 a piece. Anyway, fascinating. Okay. Electronics of all types have developed rapidly, including music-related products. There are a number of trends in stereo today, according to John Ferry, manager of Tech Hi-Fi. For example, the era of 8-track equipment has come to an end. Remember, this is in 1982 when this article is being published. Quote, the only demand we have for it is from people who are locked into it. They have a whole library of tapes they've accumulated over several years, said Ferry. If you are such a person, never fear. There is a way out. A device is available to convert 8-track players to cassette players. This is fascinating to me because I run a company where we literally do conversions of analog media to digital media today. So just hearing this whole idea of being locked into that media and then having to switch it over, it's so interesting. Anyway, do you remember doing this? I'd be curious if any of you out there remember actually went through this process where you had a big library of 8-track tapes and then you go, now what? Okay. Let's see here. Quote, it's something to get somebody by if they don't want to make a major investment, said Ferry. Quality, however, is minimal and few are available. Ferry attributes the downfall of 8-track to the nature of the industry. Since its invention, better products have come along to take its place. The current sales boom lies in portable and personal stereo. Most portables contain an AM/FM stereo in addition to a cassette player and recorder starting at about $40. More elaborate models go as high as $600. Smaller personal units range from $40 to $250. That's pretty interesting because, again, people that are around my age, do you remember the first time you saw somebody come to school with a Walkman that did this? That had the AM/FM, that even had a cassette player in it. And man, I just remember those things were so cool. And I'm from Denver, so a lot of my friends bought them because they would just take them skiing. But everybody had to have one. Remember, and then everybody walks to school and they have those little headphones that would go over your ears. They had it's so funny thinking about that. Quote, "They become very popular, although it may really be more of a fad," said Ferry. "It's the biggest change in sales we've seen in the last year. Part of the portable stereo's popularity may be due to poor economic conditions," he said. And that's pretty interesting because it was a fad in the sense that eventually we just gave up on cassettes, but it was, it went into the iPod eventually, so people loved that portable thing. I mean, even today, what do? You have your Bluetooth headphones in and you're listening to music or podcasts or whatever. So that portable thing just kind of, it didn't really go away. It wasn't a fad. It just evolved. "They offer extremely good fidelity for the dollar," said Ferry. "The industry is keyed in on the economy rather than buying a big stereo for $900. They made something smaller with all the same features that would sell for $200. Portables were also big in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think now what they're talking about is not just the Walkman, but the portable like boombox. They've got to be. I think that's what they're talking about here. Did you have a boombox? I'm actually curious. Talking to you now, watching this thing. Did you have one, and what was that all about? Do you remember that fad when that happened? You had the handle, and you'd walk around carrying those things. I had one. They were a pretty big deal. Okay, despite the economy, Ferry reports sales of stereo equipment is good and getting better. Part of this may be due to the fact that, hard as it may seem to believe, some prices are, quote, "probably coming down slightly," he said. "Thanks to technical improvements, even stereo selling prices comparable to those in years past are a better deal. Quote, there have been some yearly advances in stereo for basically the same price," he said. "With inflation figured in, that lowers the cost even more. Quote, visually, stereo is basically the same as it was several years ago. It has the same functions, but what it does is superior, a higher level of performance." And I think that's just consistent with all technology. And we happen to live in a great time when we're seeing all these advances happening. But I do remember, the early portable radio days. I had one, with just a little handle on top, and it would just do FM, AM. But over time, as they added the cassette and then two speakers and then the speaker and the tweeter, and they just got bigger and better sounding and louder and more powerful over time. And, you'd see people walking around with the thing over there. I did. I was from a suburb in Denver, and everybody was walking around with these things. It was really interesting to watch that, cranking out their music. And anyway, do you remember that? Did you have one? And were you one of those people walking around with a boombox? I did. So anyway, so interesting reading this stuff. And of course, follow the channel, like this video if you enjoy this kind of thing. And if you enjoyed this, there's a good chance other people that would too. So please share that with them. And as always, of course, have yourself a fantastic day.